I thought I was being called in for a routine meeting. What my boss shared instead changed the way I saw my work, my past, and myself. Stay with me, because this story takes a turn you might not expect. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from. What city or town are you in today? And if stories like this speak to you, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video. It truly helps us keep sharing meaningful stories like this one. Thank you for being here. I still remember the sound of the office door closing behind me. It wasn't loud, just a soft click, but it felt like it echoed longer than it should have. The hallway outside had been buzzing moments earlier with phones ringing and keyboards tapping, but in his office, everything seemed quieter, slower, almost suspended. My boss, David, sat behind his desk, reading glasses resting low on his nose. Late 50s, silver hair he never quite managed to tame, the kind of man who looked serious even when he smiled. I had worked under him for nearly 8 years. We'd spoken hundreds of times, maybe thousands, but always about deadlines, reports, the practical details of keeping a business moving forward. "Please, have a seat," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. I smoothed my skirt as I sat down, noticing the familiar scent of old books and fresh coffee that always lingered in his office. The afternoon light came through the tall window behind him, casting long shadows across the framed certificates on the wall. For a moment he didn't speak. He just looked at me, thoughtful, almost hesitant. I ran through possibilities in my mind. Had I missed something? Made a mistake? At my age, you learn not to jump to conclusions, but that doesn't stop your stomach from tightening anyway. "You're not in trouble," he said finally, as if reading my thoughts. A small smile touched his face. "I wanted to talk to you about something personal, if that's all right." That caught me off guard. Personal wasn't a word he used lightly. I nodded, unsure but curious. He leaned back slightly, folding his hands. "I've watched your work for years. Your consistency, your patience with others, the way you handle pressure without needing applause. Not everyone notices those things, but I do." I felt a warmth rise in my chest, mixed with confusion. Praise was nice, of course, but this felt different. Slower, more deliberate. "There comes a point," he continued, "when you realize titles and numbers don't tell the whole story of a person. I'm at that point now." I listened closely, aware of the steady ticking of the clock on his shelf. Each second felt intentional. He told me about his own early years, about choices he'd made out of fear rather than confidence. He spoke of moments when someone had believed in him before he believed in himself. I had never heard him speak this openly. It was like seeing a familiar building with the lights on at night, revealing rooms you didn't know existed. Then he said something that truly surprised me. "I see you standing at a crossroads," he said gently. "And I don't think anyone's ever told you that it's okay to want more. Not more money, more meaning." No one had ever put it that way before. I thought of the years behind me, the careful decisions, the responsibilities, the quiet dreams I'd packed away because life required practicality. I felt seen in a way that was both comforting and unsettling. "I called you in here," he said, meeting my eyes, "because I respect you, and because I believe the next step you take matters. Not just for this company, but for you." I didn't speak right away. My throat felt tight, but not from sadness. From recognition. From the realization that this conversation wasn't about authority or obligation. It was about trust. As I left his office later, the hallway sounded different, brighter somehow. I knew this meeting was only the beginning of something I didn't yet fully understand, but for the first time in a long while, I felt open to discovering what might come next. I didn't tell anyone about that meeting. Not that evening, not the next morning. I carried it with me like a folded letter in my pocket, something private and important, something I wasn't ready to unfold in front of anyone else. That night at home, I made dinner on autopilot. The familiar sounds of the pan, the hum of the refrigerator, the evening news murmuring in the background. I'd done these things 1,000 times, yet my mind kept drifting back to David's office. The way he'd spoken, the calm in his voice, the care behind his words. It wasn't flattering in the shallow sense. It felt heavier than that. Earned. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about crossroads and meaning. At my age, you're not supposed to be standing at crossroads anymore. You're supposed to be settled, decided, but his words had stirred something I'd learned to keep quiet. The next morning, I arrived at work earlier than usual. The parking lot was nearly empty, dew still clinging to the edges of the cars. Inside, the building felt peaceful before the rush, like it was taking a deep breath. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at my desk, not opening my computer right away. Around mid-morning, an email popped up from David. Short. Polite. He asked if I had time later that afternoon to continue our conversation. My heart skipped, not from fear, but from curiosity. I typed back yes before I could overthink it. When the time came, I walked to his office with a steadier pace than the day before. This time, the door was already open. Sunlight spilled across the floor, and he was standing by the window, looking out over the street below. "Thank you for coming back," he said, turning toward me. "Please, sit." I noticed he hadn't brought any files with him. No folders, no laptop. Just 2 cups of coffee on the small table by the chairs. He handed one to me, and our fingers brushed briefly. Nothing dramatic, just human. A simple reminder that we were 2 people sharing a moment, not just titles in a company directory. "I wanted to be clear," he said, settling into his chair. "Yesterday wasn't about pressure or expectations. It was about honesty." I nodded, appreciating the directness. "I'm approaching a stage in my life where mentorship matters more to me than management," he continued. "I don't want to just oversee work anymore. I want to pass on perspective, and I believe you're someone who understands people, not just processes." I thought about the younger employees who often came to me with questions that had nothing to do with spreadsheets. I'd always listened, never thinking much of it. Hearing him frame it that way gave those moments new weight. He asked me about my life outside the office, not in a nosy way, but with genuine interest. I told him about the years of balancing work and responsibility, about how I'd learned to be reliable because others depended on me. I didn't tell him everything, but I told him enough. As I spoke, I realized how rarely anyone had asked me these things without an agenda, without trying to fix or change me. He simply listened. "There's a role opening up soon," he said carefully. "It's not just a promotion. It's a shift. More voice. More influence. But it requires confidence and the willingness to be seen." The word "seen" lingered between us. "I don't need an answer now," he added. "I just wanted you to know I see potential where you might see routine." When I left his office that second time, I felt taller somehow. Not because of ambition, but because of permission. Permission to consider myself unfinished, still growing. Over the next few days, our interactions changed in subtle ways. Not closer, not distant, just more aware. A shared understanding that something important had been named out loud. I caught my reflection in the restroom mirror one afternoon and barely recognized the expression on my face. It wasn't youth, and it wasn't nostalgia. It was possibility. Quiet, steady possibility. And as the week drew to a close, I understood that whatever lay ahead, this wasn't about him calling me into his office. It was about me stepping into a part of myself I'd almost forgotten was there. The days that followed took on a different rhythm. Nothing on the surface had changed. Emails still arrived. Meetings still filled the calendar. But underneath it all, there was a quiet awareness, like hearing a low note beneath a familiar song. I started paying closer attention to myself. The way I spoke up in meetings instead of waiting to be asked. The way I trusted my instincts when reviewing a proposal. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it felt important. I realized how often I had made myself smaller without anyone asking me to. David noticed too, though he never called it out directly. Instead, he'd ask for my thoughts in front of others, not to put me on the spot, but to make space. I watched how the room shifted when that happened, how people listened, how my voice didn't shake the way it once might have. One afternoon, he asked if I'd walk with him to the nearby cafe. Not a meeting, he said, just fresh air. We stepped outside together, the late season breeze cool against my face. The street was busy, but in a comfortable, ordinary way. People going about their lives, unaware of the small turning points happening inside others. Over coffee, he spoke about leadership, about how experience carries a responsibility to guide without controlling. He admitted mistakes he'd made in the past, times he'd confused authority with certainty. Hearing that from him made something settle inside me. It reminded me that growth doesn't end at a certain age. It just changes shape. "I don't want you to become someone else," he said quietly. "I want you to become more of who you already are." That sentence stayed with me long after we returned to the office. That evening, I pulled out an old notebook from a drawer at home. Pages filled with thoughts I'd written years ago, plans I never followed through on. Reading them now, I didn't feel regret. I felt understanding. I had done what I needed to do back then, and now maybe I was allowed to want something different. The following week, David invited me to sit in on a strategic meeting I'd never been part of before. The room was larger, the table longer, the conversation sharper. I felt the familiar flutter of nerves, but I stayed grounded. When I spoke carefully, honestly. No performance, just clarity. Afterward, one of the senior managers stopped me in the hallway. "I'm glad you were in there," he said. "You brought a perspective we don't always hear." I smiled, surprised by how natural it felt. Later that day, David called me into his office again. This time there was no suspense, just two people reflecting on progress. "You handled yourself well," he said. "More importantly, you trusted yourself." I realized then that this journey wasn't about approval. It was about alignment, about finally standing where my experience and my voice met. As I left his office, I felt a calm confidence settle in. Not excitement, not fear. Just readiness. Whatever the next step was, I knew I wouldn't step into it by accident. I would choose it. By the time the offer became official, it no longer felt like a surprise. It felt like the natural next sentence in a conversation that had been unfolding for weeks. David asked me to come into his office late on a Friday afternoon. The building was quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that comes when people are already thinking about the weekend. The light outside had softened, turning the windows into warm mirrors. He didn't make a speech. He never did. "I'd like you to take the role," he said simply. "Not because you're ready in every way, but because you're willing to grow into it." I looked at the paper he slid across the desk, but what I really saw was everything behind it. The trust, the responsibility, the acknowledgement of years that hadn't been wasted, just lived. "I want to be clear," I said after a moment. "If I do this, I do it as myself, not a version that fits expectations." He nodded without hesitation. "That's exactly why I'm asking you." I accepted, not with a rush of excitement, but with a deep, steady breath, the kind you take when you know you're standing on solid ground. In the weeks that followed, the changes came slowly. A new office, new conversations, different decisions. Some days were challenging. On others, I surprised myself. Through it all, David remained what he had been from the start, respectful, steady, present when needed, but never hovering. One afternoon, as we wrapped up a discussion, he paused at the door. "You know," he said, "this has reminded me why I stayed in this work as long as I did." I smiled. It reminded me why I didn't leave. We shared a quiet laugh, and then he went on his way. Looking back now, I understand that the unexpected part of that first meeting wasn't what he said. It was what it allowed me to say to myself. That I wasn't done. That experience isn't something you age out of, but something you carry forward. That being seen can be a beginning, not a disruption. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Sometimes the most meaningful turning points don't arrive with noise or drama. Sometimes they arrive in a quiet office with afternoon light on the wall and a conversation rooted in respect. And sometimes answering that call changes more than your career. It changes how you see your own story, still unfolding one honest step at a time.